Hola a todos, soy Javier Poveda y esto es De Bien TV, el canal donde te lo vas a pasar, de bien, me quedo sin ideas, mientras aprendes geografía, historia del arte y este año un poquito de economía y de empresariales. Este vídeo va dirigido a mis alumnos de primero de la ESO sección del CEIPSO Encinar de Torrelodones. In this video we are going to finish the Unit 6, the climates and landscapes of the world, with the second part, the extreme climates and landscapes. So, magic, woo! And here we are in this beautiful presentation, which you have uploaded already to the virtual classroom. So, let's start. Okay, let's start with the first of the climates, which is the equatorial climate. As its name says, the equatorial climate is found in areas near the equator, the Amazon basin, here, parts of Central America, the Congo, the Gulf of Guinea, and Southeast Asia, okay, in areas next to the parallel zero, which is the equator. In these regions, the temperatures are always very high, around 25 degrees, as you can see here in these climate graphs, okay, more or less around 25 degrees, and they barely vary all year long, so the thermal range is very small. It is usually between or around 5 degrees of thermal range, okay. As you can see here, the temperature is almost constant throughout all the year. The rainfall is very heavy, over 1500 millimeters per year, and usually it is over 2000 millimeters, and this is because the evaporation is so intense and the level of humidity so high that even a slight drop in temperature at dusk can cause torrential rain. Okay, since it rains a lot and the temperature is very high, this is a very humid, these are very humid areas. So how or what natural landscapes can we find here? Because of this persistent rain, the rivers in these regions are among the highest flowing and most regular on Earth, and the rainwater carries fine soil into rivers, and that's why they have this brown color. The vegetation is lush and varied, lush frondosa, especially evergreen trees. O sea, vegetación que se llama siempre verde, o sea, muy verde, due to the high temperatures and heavy rainfall. And this type of vegetation is called rainforest or jungle, la selva o la jungla. And these rainforests are one of the most biologically rich and diverse environments on the planet. Okay, this vegetation grows at different levels and they usually look for the light. That is why these are very tall trees, because they need to reach the sunlight. Okay, let's see some examples. The Amazonas rainforest here in Peru. This is the river Amazonas. As you can see, this brown river, and it carries a lot of water. It has a very abundant flow. Okay, this is the rainforest. You see very lush vegetation, frondosísimo todo. Also the jungle, which is the name that the rainforest has in Asia. Okay, this is Malaysia, for example. And in the humanized landscapes, here in these areas are inhabited by indigenous peoples in America and Africa, and they are still in the Paleolithic or in the Neolithic. They survive by gathering fruit, by hunting, or by practicing a subsistence agriculture. So therefore the population density is very low. But in contrast, in the Asian regions, they are way more densely populated. Okay, because in Asia we have lots of millions of people. The Asian rainforests are getting smaller as land is cleared to cultivate rice, sugarcane, tea, and rubber. And in some cases, they even build big cities, for example, like Singapore. Okay, let's see some examples. Here we have plantations. For example, in Malaysia, they have cut down all this jungle, and now this land is cultivated. We have also indigenous tribes living in these areas, for example, these indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazonas, and in some cases the rainforest or the jungle, like in this case in Singapore, which is Asia, it has been cut down and they have built cities next to the jungle. Okay. The next climate we have to study is a tropical climate. This climate can be found, as its name says, in the areas near the tropics. Okay, for example, here in Central America and in big parts of South America, in most of the southern half of Africa and the south of Asia and the north of Australia. In these regions, the temperatures are high all year long, as well as in the equatorial climate, and the thermal range is very narrow, but is a bit wider or it's a bit bigger than in the equatorial climates. As you can see here in the temperature line, we can see a very small variation. Okay. And you can recognize this climate by the precipitation, or looking at the precipitation, because the rains mark two different seasons: the wet season, which occurs in summer, and the dry season, which occurs in winter. Okay? The regions furthest from the equator have the longest dry season, so the closest you are to the equator, the more rain you will have. As you can see here, this is Darwin in Australia, the southern hemisphere, and as you know, in the southern hemisphere, the summer occurs in January, February, and March, in which we have the biggest precipitation. And Bamako, Mali, northern hemisphere, in the summer we have the most precipitation. Okay. Let's see the natural tropical landscapes. In these areas, the river flows vary greatly throughout the year. During the dry season, the rivers carry very little water because there is no rain. But in the rainy season, in the wet season, they usually overflow and sometimes cause flooding, inundaciones, due to the heavy rain. We have tropical forests here in these regions, well, in the ones closest to the equator, with vegetation similar to that of the rainforest, although it is less varied. Okay, and there is more. The trees are more spaced. There are more space between the trees, and sometimes we find in gallery forest. That forest which the tops of the trees touch between each other. However, the most common landscape in these areas is the savanna, la sabana, which has many grasses and shrubs and some scarce and grouped in small units of trees, okay, throughout all this plain. And in the wet season, the vegetation remains green and lush, but when the dry season arrives, the plants dry out and fires are common. This is the landscape we see, for example, in The Lion King. Farther from the equator, where the wet season is shorter, the vegetation is made up of thorny shrubs and areas of bare soil, suelo desnudo. Here the savanna becomes the steppe, la estepa. Let's see some examples. This is a tropical rainforest. As you can see, the vegetation is similar to the equatorial rainforest, but it is not so lush. This is the savanna. As you can see, shrubs and grass, and a few trees which are separated from each other. This is Africa, and this is Venezuela. Okay, a big extension of land, of grassland, with some groups of trees which are isolated from each other in many areas. Okay, and this is the steppe, where we have bare soil or just a little grass in the ground, and very few trees. The humanized tropical landscapes. We still have indigenous people in the savannah, for example the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, and they keep animals and they practice extensive livestock farming. But in other inhabitants, they also practice agriculture, a very traditional agriculture. But maybe the most common humanized landscape are the plantations. Okay, the extensive plantation dedicated to this cultivation of tropical crops, for example, coffee, tea, cocoa, tobacco, pineapple, and more. And these plantations can alter the traditional vegetation and mostly the landscape, as we will see. This is a traditional village in the savannah, in the Kikuletwa in Tanzania, and this is a coffee plantation in Costa Rica. Okay, they have, look at this. This is tea, this is coffee, this is what you, well, not you, but me, what I drink in my breakfast. This is coffee, this is tea. When you see this, a lot of this extensive land which is cultivated, and it is very long lines with very similar crops. These are plantations. This is tea in India, and this is cocoa in Ghana. Then here, among these, or within these tropical climates, there is a special one which has its own typology, which is the monsoon climate, el monzón. The monsoons are a type of seasonal wind you have here in this map, the summer monsoon and the winter monsoon. And the main characteristic of this climate, of this monsoon climate, is the very immensely high precipitation, which can come up to 12,000 millimeters a year and cause severe flooding. The monsoon climate, as well as the rest of the tropical climates, it has a constant temperature throughout the year, and it has a very heavy but also very irregular rainfall. We have the monsoon season in the summer. And this climate, we can find it in Southeast Asia, mostly in India and the Indochina Peninsula, in the southeast of Asia. And that is why in these regions it is very common to see rice crops or the rice cultivation, which is tied to this special type of climate because the rice needs a lot of water to grow. These are rice terraces, and as you know, the rice is cultivated underneath the water. That's why we have these little lakes, if we can use this word, in these areas. Then we go to the hot desert climate. We find it in various parts of the world, but mostly in the tropics. Okay. They are located near the tropics. For example, we have the Sahara, the Gobi, the Namib, the Australian desert, Atacama, and the desert of the westerns in the United States. Well, the deserts can be coastal deserts and inland deserts because of the influence of the marine currents, but this is not important. So let's go. Here you have the climate graphs. As you can see, in the desert climates, the rainfall is very irregular and very scarce, usually below 250 millimeters a year, and at least we have 9 arid months, but usually all of the months are arid. And the temperature range is within the day is very big, so in the morning or in the afternoon the temperatures are very high, but in the night they are cold. Okay. In the deserts, at night, it is cold, so the average temperatures are lower than equatorial and tropical climates, yet they are still high. And as you can see, we can also see a wide annual thermal range. Okay, when you see these high temperatures and very scarce rain, you are looking at a hot desert climate. The natural landscapes. In the deserts, there are no permanent watercourses, but in some deserts we can find wadis, which are riverbeds, cauces, that remain dry for most of the year and only contain water when it rains. And since it rains, there is very few precipitation, they only carry water during certain periods of the year. And as you know, very few plants grow in the desert, but there are some plants, ojo, and those that do have adapted to the harsh conditions, las condiciones tan extremas. They have small leaves to reduce transpiration, which allows them to conserve water. And we have different types of desert. The most common one is the one covered in sand and characterized by dunes, which is called erg. The other type of desert combines sand, stone, and rock. It's a rocky desert, which is called reg. These are Arab words. This is a wadi. This is a empty riverbed. When it rains, this riverbed carries water. Okay, but most of the year it is empty. Okay, it is dry. This is in the Negev Desert in Israel. This is the Sahara Desert in Morocco. And this is an erg because it is made out of sand. And this is a red desert in Cabo Verde, in which we have sand, but we also have a lot of rocks and stones. The humanized desert landscape, the deserts are scarcely populated. There are very few people living there, and we can find nomadic herdsmen living on the edges, en los bordes. Herdsmen are pastores, no? Their goats and camels graze on the scarce vegetation found on the steppe, and the nomads move around in search of places where it has rained and there are underground sources of water. How do we call these underground sources of water that sometimes they come out to the surface? Oases. Oases, this is a plural, oasis, it's singular. In near these oases, we can find sedentary populations in which people live always there. Okay, then they don't move because the water from the underground streams rises to the surface through springs and wells, pozos y manantiales. And in certain countries which are very rich because of the oil extraction, they can finance new construction techniques and materials to improve comfort, and they have built cities in the desert. This usually happens in the Arab Peninsula. Let's see that. This is an oasis in Huacachina, Peru. Okay, this is, as you can see, an underground deposit that has come out to the surface, and we have vegetation here in the desert and some sedentary population. These are nomadic herdsmen in the Sahara Desert in Morocco. These are the Tuaregs, which what they do for a living, they camel grazing. And as you can see, there is some vegetation in the desert, okay? And the cities in the desert, the most famous are Abu Dhabi, Dubai, most of them in the United Arab Emirates in the Arab Peninsula. And finally, the last two climates, we are studying them together, but they are two different climates, okay? They are the polar and the high mountain climates. The polar climates are found in the ends of the Earth, in the poles, in the Arctic regions, and in the southern polar regions, in Antarctica. And the high mountain climates are found all around the world in all the areas that, or in which the mountain ranges are located, generally with altitudes above 1,500 meters or maybe 2,000 meters, okay? For example, Andes, Rocky Mountains, Himalaya, etc., etc., okay? These are only some of these regions, okay? But, for example, in Spain, we can find high mountain climate in Sistema Central, Pirineos, Cordillera Cantábrica, Sistema Bético, etc. So first, let's look at the climate graphs. This is polar climate graphs. In these regions, the temperatures are low throughout the year, and the average is always below 0 degrees. For example, in this place, in Thule, in Greenland, the average temperature is minus 11 degrees. Okay, and the temperatures are low throughout the year, and they only surpass the 0 degrees mark here a few months of the year, usually in summer. And the precipitation is generally scarce, and during the winter as snowflakes. That is why they are sometimes called cold deserts, these areas. In the high mountain regions, the temperatures are low, okay, more or less low all year long, even though in summer they can reach the 15 or 20 degree mark. And the precipitation is abundant. It's as you can see here, 1,240 millimeters in La Molina de los Pirineos, and usually in summer, and mostly I mean in summer. Let's see the landscapes. The natural and humanized landscapes in the polar regions are almost, the landscapes are almost always covered with a thick ice sheet, con una fina capa de hielo, una gruesa, capa de hielo, and are referred as cold deserts. In the summer, the ice-free land, which is called the tundra, is covered with mosses, lichens, and small flowers, and it grows only in the northern hemisphere, okay, North America, Asia, and Europe. Because of the underground being permanently frozen, which is called the permafrost, no trees are grown because they cannot grow roots. And in the regions closest to the poles, there is no vegetation at all because it is mostly ice. The tundra has traditionally been inhabited by the Inuit in America and the Sami in Europe and Asia, los esquimales, who are hunting and fishing communities, and in some areas like Greenland or Alaska we have small settlements close to the sea and with houses painted in many colors. What do they do for a living? Fishing, oil extraction, and sometimes a bit of tourism. This is the tundra, okay? Mosses and lichens and no trees at all. This is very easy to identify. This is the Arctic tundra. This is the permafrost, okay? Below this tundra, underneath the ground, we have this frozen soil, okay? This is called the permafrost. And in the areas that are inhabited, we can find these small settlements in which the main economy is fishing, and with these characteristic houses painted in many vivid colors. In the high mountain, we can find that the vegetation varies depending on the latitude and the altitude and the orientation of the mountain. In all cases, the vegetation is distributed in zones of different altitude. Okay, there is not the same vegetation at the bottom of the mountain that at the top of the mountain. In the lower zones or the valleys, we can find agricultural meadows for the livestock, and as the altitude increases, we observe mixed forest, then deciduous forest, then high mountain meadows, lo de Heidi, and finally at the top we can find perpetual snow and glaciers if there are any. The inhabitants of these regions are mostly dedicated to livestock farming, the forest exploitation, the logging, la tala, and the hydroelectric power production. The agriculture is concentrated at the bottom of the valleys, which is obvious because the land is more flat, and we have tourist activities such as snow sports like skiing or mountain climbing, which are increasingly popular in these regions, so we can find many ski resorts that are built, and they change enormously the landscape. This is a high mountain landscape in Switzerland. In the bottom of the valleys we can find meadows and some agriculture places. Then we find the forest, and as we are increasing the altitude, the vegetation starts to disappear until we reach the perpetual snow at the top of the mountains. And in many of these places we have this humanized landscape, the tourist resorts, like in this case this ski resort in the French Alps. So, as you know, you should have in your notebook these charts with the type of climate, the locations, temperatures, precipitations, natural and humanized landscapes, and an example of a climate graph for every and each one of these climates we have seen: equatorial, tropical, hot desert, polar, and high mountain climates. And the end, this is the desert biome in Minecraft. Recordad que para estudiar este tema lo más útil es hacerse un cuadrito, que ya he visto en el examen de cuaderno que os clavé ayer, que no lo habéis hecho la mayoría. Muy mal. Hay que hacerlo, ¿vale? Porque así es mucho más sencillo estudiar estos temas, ¿vale? Porque simplemente hay que saberse cada una de las características de cada uno de estos temas. Recordad que para cualquier duda me podéis escribir por los canales habituales, el correo, la Aula Virtual o incluso el Instagram en cdfdaisy, y si no, me podéis seguir en twitch.tv de Bienstream, donde hago streaming los domingos después de comer. Espero que este vídeo os haya servido de ayuda y nos vemos en el próximo, que ya será de historia. empezaremos la prehistoria ya por fin. Muchas gracias por estar ahí y haberlo visto y nos vemos en el próximo.